Okay, so I'm going to get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Simona Capisani, and I'm presenting some work for myself and my co-author, Hélène Benveniste, who is an environmental policy specialist at Harvard University. And like was introduced, I am at Durham University. I'm an environmental philosopher working on issues of climate change and political philosophy. And the project we're going to talk about today focuses on a new normative approach for governing climate mobilities. And it's an outgrowth of an interdisciplinary project between the two of us. All right, let's see. Okay. And so let me start by setting the stage here. Dave already did a really wonderful job, so hopefully I won't reiterate too much of what he said. But what we want to talk about when we're talking about climate mobilities, as many of you know in the room, is not just an issue about cross-border migration, but it also includes internal migration and immobility. And climate change has been observed to induce either more movement or more immobility and has various degrees of agency within that mobility outcome. So some of the examples in the last talk were really helpful to see that. This is maybe a visual representation of that heterogeneity of climate impacts. So starting from the top left picture, you see that displacement involves movement with relatively low degrees of agency. On the top right, migration is widely understood or used as an adaptation strategy to climate change impacts with a high degree of agency. And then the bottom two pictures illustrate cases of immobility, with the bottom right highlighting the option of adapting to climate impacts in situ without having to move if one doesn't want to. So high degrees of agency in those outcomes. And then, of course, on the bottom left, illustrating the fact that climate change depletes resources, thereby limiting the ability to migrate. And so that notion of agency coming up in the IPCC report that was just mentioned is key to also understanding the dimensions of movement to non-movement. But despite that observed complexity and heterogeneity of climate mobility outcomes, the current relevant international policy landscape, as many of you know, largely focuses on movement while ignoring immobility, and mostly focuses solely on cross-border movement. And, in cases of this, oversight of the kind of complexity there, we wanted to raise the question of how do we change the governance landscape to better address the full range of climate mobility outcomes? And so in order to answer this question, we say, well, let's start and get back to some fundamental principles to guide this. So ethically, the question we're raising, what is owed to people whose mobility ends up being affected by climate change? And so people have been trying to answer this question recently by proposing different various approaches, both normative and policy-based. Three of the most prevalent include the refugee status, a humanitarian approach that draws from humanitarian obligations, and loss and damage. And each of these approaches, I won't get into it here, but can elaborate in the Q&A, only really generates responsibility to address ex post claims to protection, where the obligation to address climate mobilities are responsive rather than preemptive. So in each of their own ways, they're insufficient to cover the full empirical reality of climate mobilities that I just addressed on the last slide. So instead, we're proposing another normative framework that provides a principled, justice-based approach to addressing the full range of climate mobility outcomes. And this framework is based on what we're calling the right to a livable space or the right to a livable locality. Okay. So quickly, why is there a right to livable space? So we find that this right emerges from the way we've organized the global international world order, namely the Westphalian territorial state system, which divides all inhabitable land under state-based authorities with the purported goals and aims to achieve peace, stability, and the protection of basic rights. So hence, any kind of exclusion within the context of that state system has to be justified in light of those aims, those goals. And if exclusion from the system leads to some sort of failure to secure those aims, then the very legitimacy of the state system itself is brought into question. So what is new about this system within the context of climate change? Under conditions of climate change, traditional ways of guarding against exclusion from the state system may no longer be sufficient. And so it's under these new conditions that the right to a livable space becomes more apparent. When climate change renders people's homes uninhabitable, for instance, the right to a livable space is threatened and violated. And so what do we mean by livable space in this context? Well, people are not merely existing in some static way within space. Rather, they occupy space in a relational way. So adapting their bodies to spaces that they occupy, as well as those spaces to their own needs and wishes. So an individual has to be able to both shape their environment and not just be shaped by it. So hence, securing the right to a livable space is a necessary guiding principle of the territorial state system itself. Because if we fail to protect that right, the state system is not legitimate on its own self-imposed terms. And so why is a right to livable space well suited for addressing climate mobilities? We see at least three primary reasons. First, the right ensures that people keep that same reflexive relationship to space that I just mentioned. So it establishes a requirement to increase the agency of immobile populations so that the choice to stay remains. Second, the right to a livability or livable locality provides grounds not solely for ex post protections, but also for preemptive protection. That's where it deviates from previous proposals. So for instance, it requires facilitating voluntary migration if that migration decreases the risks to exclusion. And third and finally, the right to a livable locality bypasses some controversial issues of responsibility, because responsibility is addressed to the state system itself, on our view, not to any one given state. And so when the right is violated, it's not due to any one state's failure to act, but rather due to the structure of the state system under climate stress. Okay, and so because that model of responsibility that it offers is borne by the state system as a whole, appropriate governance mechanism at the international level arises as a key necessary element for addressing climate mobilities. So which international governance scheme could harbor best the implementation of such a right? We argue that the Paris Agreement is best suited, and why? I'm getting a 1 minute, so I'm just going to run really quickly through some suggestions, and I can elaborate more in Q&A. But first, the Paris Agreement's potential to include both movement and immobility and to uphold both ex ante and ex post protection claims is there, which offers at least two benefits that are not offered by other different institutions on the international level. And these are due to specific features of the Paris Agreement, namely that it includes both adaptation and L&D as pillars of the regime. And in doing so, it gets to cover measures that address harms resulting from negative climate change impacts on mobility outcomes, as well as measures that prevent such harms from occurring. A second motivation for the Paris Agreement is that it's been designed to deal with responsibility that mirrors the very livability framework we're presenting, which is not relying on the identification of specific actors that are causally responsible for a given outcome. And as many of you already know, right, this has been an incremental success that's led to climate governance in the history of the regime. Now, before you get too excited, that does not mean we argue that the Paris Agreement is ready to address the issues of climate mobilities in its current state. Rather, we think Paris currently addresses climate mobility in a limited way as strictly part of the L&D conversation. And yet the normative definitions of loss and damage at the moment do not account for immobility outcomes, nor do they lay the groundwork for any kind of preemptive claims to protection. And so how might Paris need to change its treatment of climate mobilities? To answer this question, we use the livability framework as a central way to understand how to make these kinds of changes within the structure. One example of a pathway forward for this is that if we preserve our current understandings of loss and damage, then how that will be impacted in the context of climate mobilities, it will only address a specific narrow part of those outcomes, in which case, we then need to understand the benefits of utilizing the adaptation pillar to address the other range of outcomes that L&D leaves out. And so following this approach, addressing ex ante claims to protection can be implementing measures that help protect or prevent a loss of livable space that then can be shoved into the scope of the adaptation obligations. A second pathway forward, and I'll end here, is that we could expand the normative scope of loss and damage, and that could help to govern the full range of climate mobilities issues. But in order to do so, we would need to understand a shift in how we're taking the notion of responsibility within L&D it needs to be able to accommodate forward-looking notions of responsibility, particularly those that currently are otherwise being qualified as adaptation measures. So in summary, we started from the claim that the current primary focus of the institutional landscape on climate mobilities is inconsistent with the empirical evidence documenting the effects of those mobility patterns. And so we proposed a normative framework based on the livability, the right to a livable space, as a way to guide the sort of shifts that we should see on the international governance mechanisms that the Paris Agreement has available to it. Thanks so much.